Welcome, everyone. Get out your fans, take off your shirts if you want to.
A nudist event.
Thank you, Shari.
Thank you, Shari.
We'll lower the microphone a little.
Okay, good.
Much better.
I'm Ann Kaufman, trustee of the Cornwall Library, and a member of the Books and
Lower the microphone.
Planning Committee.
No, just
All right, is that better?
yes.
Thank you. And glad you're listening. And I'm a member of the Books and Blooms Planning Committee, brilliantly chaired by Blake Hubbard, who's here somewhere. I speak for all of us in thanking especially our sponsors and all of you for coming tonight to support our wonderful library. Proceeds from the talk and reception and tomorrow's tours will benefit the library's programs all year long, and we hope to see you at our events, and we hope you'll take some pleasure in knowing you've helped to make it all possible. Lots of thanks are due. I'm going to be ruthlessly brief, but we want to get to Anne and we want to get to the party. Can't miss the opportunity to thank the UCC for the use of this beautiful space, our ever-cheerful, indomitable director, Margaret Hask, I guess she's outside still checking in, and Natalie and Greg Randall of Artifacts, who have been so generous in offering us the use of their stunning garden across the street for the cocktail reception, which will take place immediately following the presentation. When you go out of the church, you look to the left, and you'll see some signs, and they'll take you directly to Randall's garden. I'm thrilled to introduce Anne Temkin, tonight's speaker, for Marie Jose and Henry Kravis, Chief Curator of Painting and Sculpture at the Museum of Modern Art, New York. Tonight might be a historical moment. It's a first for me anyway, a rare moment when a preeminent curator of modern and contemporary art at if not the major art museum in this country specializing in contemporary and modern art, gives a talk on the subject of horticulture. We're in for a treat. Anne comes to us by way of Torrington, where she spent her childhood, by way of Harvard, where she received her undergraduate degree in art history, then Yale for her PhD and a dissertation on Picasso, then MoMA, then the Philadelphia Museum, and finally back to MoMA, settling into New York City and weekending, luckily for us, right here in Cornwall with her family. At MoMA, she oversaw the new installation of the collection and the reinstallations and curated, among other shows, Jasper Johns for Brett's in 2014, Picasso sculpture, the great Donald Judge show that opened right before the pandemic, and then in 2022, Matisse, the Red Studio, which I imagine a lot of people here saw. Among her many publications is the charming and insightful Claude Monet Water Lilies, a little gem, which inspired our invitation for tonight's talk. Claude Monet and the Art of the Garden. We are lucky to have Anne in our midst. Please join me in welcoming her.
Yeah, I'll just read the book. Thank you. Thank you so much, Anne. That's so nice. I'm very happy to be here this evening, bridging the worlds of painting and gardens, and have to apologize a little bit that the sun started shining about 15 minutes ago because these slides looked really great 25 minutes ago. So you're all going to have to use your imaginations a bit, but or hopefully it's going to dim pretty soon. Or we could just wait and do the whole thing at 8:30. Take a vote on that. Monet's water lily paintings, of which there are more than 200, are among the most beloved paintings of the 20th century, even though people tend to think of Monet as a as a 19th century artist. I was told how to turn this on. Ben, I need your help to get it. So here they are indeed in the 20th century collections and now 21st of MoMA. The triptych that we have and have had since the late 1950s. The water lily paintings by Monet are also one of our best examples of total interdependence of art and life. These paintings exist and look the way they look because Monet was utterly and completely besotted by his gardens. And the reverse is equally true. He spent endless time and money on the gardens because he needed them in order to paint them. So this evening, we're going to spend about 45 minutes exploring the chicken and egg, inextricably intertwined nature of these two passions of his. Then we will have time for questions, comments, your own thoughts. I'm going to start with a few basic facts. The water lilies paintings all were made at Monet's house in the village of Giverny, which is in the province of Normandy, about a 90-minute drive in the northwest of Paris. So I'm going to ask how many of you have been there. Pretty many, not everyone. My husband Wayne and I went on May 1st this year. So many of these photos that you see are his credit. To do my homework for this talk, and also because I was in Paris that week for work and discovered that absolutely everything in France is closed on May 1st. Except for Monet's house and gardens, one of the greatest tourist attractions in the country now. And you can see it was tulip season. And as you can see, if you look a little bit more carefully, if you can see, at the top of the slide, we were not alone. And that's a very big understatement. Monet moved out from Paris to Giverny in 1883, when he was 43 years old, renting a big old farmhouse to be able to paint outdoors and in what he made into a little studio attached to the house. He then purchased the house and its property a few years later, in 1890. And then in 1893, he bought an additional plot of land across a road and a set of railroad tracks from his house. He bought that plot in order to transform an existing small pond into a splendid water garden. In 1901, he bought the adjacent land to the existing water pond so that he could actually double its size. A bit addictive. That water garden became the virtually exclusive subject matter of his painting for the last 20 years of his life. But first, we're going to back up a little. Before the lily pond was created, the gardens around Monet's house provided the subjects of his paintings. So this is all through the 1880s. Here's the house that you can see, which is a big, very big structure. This garden in front of the house was 1 hectare of land, which is 2.5 acres. He called it the Clos Normand, and it covered all the property it took over the entirety of the property in front of the house. When Monet arrived, that was all fruits and vegetables because it was a working farm. He got rid of all the fruits and he got rid of all the vegetables. He also got rid of all the trees except two, which, there you go. And then built a large trellised walkway that led from the road to the house. As would be true for the water garden as well, there was absolutely nothing natural about this garden. It was completely man-made and made to be painted. That is, it was a garden planted as a place to paint, as an open-air studio. Marcel Proust wrote about Monet's garden in 1907 in an article in the Paris newspaper Le Figaro. Here's what he said. "There I shall see in a garden of tones and colors more even than of flowers, a garden that must be not so much a flower garden as a color garden, as one might call it. Flowers arranged to form a whole that is not quite as it would be in nature, since they have been sown in such a way as to ensure that only matching shades will be in bloom at any one time, forming an infinity of harmonies in drifts of blues or pinks, and somehow dematerialized by this powerfully manifested painterly will of everything but the color." So this quite marvelous quotation is actually a further example of the mix of life and art that I'm talking about, because Proust never went to Giverny. But he was writing on the basis of what he knew of the paintings, the water lily paintings that had then been almost a decade in the making, or the beginnings of them. The Clos Normand was organized and geometric. It was a garden à la Française with straight paths and right angles. I have my fancy laser there, you see the paths. This went against the fashion in France at the time, which actually was very much for the more informal and friendly English garden. Monet's garden was composed in the manner of a palette for paint, with distinct regions creating a mass of the same color and even the same flower. Irises were one of his favorites. A Wayne photo. Iris germanica, the bearded iris, was apparently his favorite of his favorite irises. And these were used by him often as an edging to the flower beds. So you have one group of flowers, but then irises along the sides. Roses were everywhere in all sorts of varieties. He mixed together perennials and annuals, and he was relatively uninterested in exotic species, with two large exceptions. He had loads of dahlias and orchids, both of which were very much in vogue at the time. Tulips, also very much in favor in the early 20th century, were among Monet's special passions. He would plant them in a range of particularly unusual colors and remarkable forms. And you see these ones we saw in May, which I hope you can see. They're almost like this very wine red and with crazy linear petals. At the outset, the garden's creation was Monet's own work, with a wife and many children, his and hers, to help. Here's Monet looking back on those years. "I would dig, plant, and hoe, and in the evening the children would water." By the end of the 1890s, he had become an expert gardener, so having lived there 15 years. Surviving letters to his wife, sent whenever he was away from Giverny, are full of instructions for her. These are, shall we say, a mix of sweetness to get her to do what he wants, and simply bossy And one detail that I read that I cannot confirm but find fascinating, he did not allow the children to talk to the flowers with the familiar tu in French, but made them use the formal, like they'd use for adults, vous. He became a ravenous buyer of horticultural dictionaries and plant catalogs, which are all still in his library in the house in Giverny. If he were alive today, you can just picture him staying up all night on his computer, compulsively searching online for new sources of plants and seeds. He made do with these printed catalogs, and he in fact used just 2 suppliers for the most part. And you and I could all use the same ones because they are still in existence in France. The first one is Villemorin, and this is a page from a Villemorin catalog from 1879, and they sold the uninteresting fruits and vegetables, as you can see, as well as flowers. But their early catalogs are things of beauty themselves. So that's Villemorin. And then secondly, Truffaut, like Francois Truffaut, the filmmaker. And here you see a 2024 website ad for them. It is their bicentennial this year. So between those 2, he spent all the money that he had on flowers. As I mentioned, it was in 1893 that Monet purchased the land across the street and across the railroad tracks with the idea of constructing a new garden, one based on a little scrap of pond that was there, more like a little bog. It was not an easy matter for Monet to build his water garden. He needed to divert a branch of the river Epte, which is a tributary of the Seine, that empties into the Seine very close to Giverny. It was not a quick process. There were numerous objections from the neighbors who were worried about the river being poisoned by exotic plant species and a host of other not in my backyard concerns. He finally managed to obtain a special dispensation from the local government to build it. And don't forget, at this point, he is the most famous living painter in France. As you can see, it's far from a simple pond like Mohawk Pond. Instead, it is a dream landscape intermixing solid and liquid, verticals and horizontals, firmness and suppleness. The pond and its surroundings were shaped, designed, and planted as if Monet were painting a painting. So we all think about the water lilies as the water and the lilies, but as so many of the paintings that we're seeing demonstrate, it's the trees around them, it's the bushes around them, it's all of the surrounding area that becomes as much an obsession and as much a subject for the paintings. Here he is in 1905. So where does this desire from, on Monet's part, come from? One, I mean, obviously there's never one answer. One answer that is discussed quite often is that it was part of a late 19th century rage across France for all things Japanese. And the Japanese were very much water lily gardeners, as many of you who've maybe been to Japan and visited water lily gardens there could attest. Monet, like many of his fellow painters, was a Japanophile. In his house by the garden, he owned dozens and dozens and displayed dozens and dozens of Japanese prints, which are often spoken about for their influence and real true impact on modern French painting of the time. But specifically, His source of inspiration, and literally his source, for the water lilies was a Frenchman from the south named Joseph Latour Marliac, who had established a water lily nursery in southwest France in 1875. He was the first person in France to cultivate water lilies in colors. Until then in France, you could only buy white water lilies. And he did a whole bunch of hybridizing that gave him a palette ranging from yellow to red to purple water lilies. So Marliac presented a water lily garden outside the Trocadero at the Universal Exposition of 1889 in Paris. By the way, that's the same occasion at which the Eiffel Tower made its debut. Kind of different. Monet was there, and it was the love at first sight, eureka moment, lightning bolt, whatever you want to describe. The Latour Marliac Archive, the company is still in existence today, and so we can all buy water lilies from them, has in its files Monet's very first order for plants, made in 1894, so 5 years later. It wasn't quick, but just a year after the pond got built. Along with 3 kinds of water lilies, he ordered many lotus plants, which did not take, and so never made it into any paintings. He also ordered a wide variety of plants, including water smartweed, water chestnut, marsh marigold, white cotton grass, and marsh bennywort. And besides, and before Latour Marliac's pioneering work with water lilies, he was the foremost expert on bamboo in France, and he supplied Monet with much bamboo as well. And that was, for me, one of the most beautiful things in May, these just huge clumps of bamboo on these little islands in between the water. So the two men became friends, and in a very real sense, collaborators, even though Latour Marliac was down in the southwest corner of France, and Monet was up in Giverny in Normandy. Monet's earliest paintings of the water garden in the mid-1890s had been fairly descriptive in the conventional manner of Impressionist landscape painting, which at the time wasn't conventional, but to us now seems it. Beginning in 1903, however, Monet began to concentrate on works that dispensed with the traditional structure of landscape painting. For example, omitting the horizon, the sky, and the ground. Instead, he focused directly on the surface of the pond and its reflections, sometimes including a hint of the pond's edge, just to situate you in space. In 1909, Monet showed 48 of this decade's worth of water lily paintings in a show at Durand-Ruel, his gallery in Paris. The paintings were a great success, only bolstering his reputation as the greatest Impressionist painter, and, not incidentally, ensuring him the financial means to keep expanding the garden. By now, the water garden was virtually the sole subject of his paintings. Correspondingly, for the last 2 decades of his life, he lavished his attentions on this water garden to the degree that it required the daily labor not only of a head gardener, but 5 additional gardeners working full-time under his supervision. So 5 days a week, he had 6 men reporting to him for work on the gardens. We all could use that. Following his great success with the 1909 exhibition of his water lilies paintings, however, things took a turn for the worst. I need to get this in. His wife died in 1911, and his son Jean in 1914. Then, worse, in 1912, at age 72, Monet was diagnosed with cataracts, and his eyesight began the steady deterioration that would continue for the rest of his life. And here you see him with the kind of snazzy dark glasses that he did wear pretty much all the time for those last 20 years. And as many of you may know, when these water lily paintings first were discussed by perplexed observers and even art historians, they were analyzed not in formal terms, but they were analyzed as evidence of eye disease. That was the only explanation that could be found for why they looked as abstract, we would say today, as they did. They really felt that you, as a painter, were recording what you saw, because that's what they had learned in school. And if this is what he was able to see and recording, that just was evidence that his eyes were bad, which they were. However, that's not how art historians today tend to comprehend the pictures. And Monet was very aware of this. He was aware of the tragedy of it, full on recognizing it, and in fact would mention oftentimes to people that Beethoven composed when he was deaf for the last 20 years of his life. And if Beethoven could do those symphonies and everything else deaf, I can do my water lily paintings nearly blind. Of course, also, then back to 19-teens, the war began. World War I caused most of his friends and family to leave Giverny, including his other son, Michel, who went to the war. But Monet remained, saying that his painting helped distract him from the horrible news of the war, and that his only refuge was in his studio. And speaking of which, not only did Monet stay put in Giverny at his home during the war, he embarked on the largest building project of his life, architecturally. Already by the turn of the century, he had begun talking to friends about the idea of making what we today would call an immersive environment. And here are his words to a friend: a circular room in which the walls above the baseboard would be covered with paintings of water, dotted with these plants to the very horizon. Today, we would call it the water lilies experience. He realized that he was going to make immense canvases of this sort, of the water garden, for some kind of panoramic environment. He needed more room to work. So in 1914, at the outbreak of war, he began construction on a vast new studio on the northeast corner of his property. It was a totally utilitarian structure, completely functional in design, with a concrete floor and a glass ceiling, which was a new idea then, that you would just have pure skylight as your roof. Monet would lament that for the sake of his art, he had added an eyesore to his property. On the subject of eyesore, though, for those of you who go to Giverny now, the true sacrilege is that that studio is the gift shop. And we're talking about a building which is bigger than the building we're all in right now, taller than the building we're in probably by a bit, and longer by quite a bit. So that's a lot of merch you can buy. The building was 39 feet wide, 76 feet long, and 49 feet high. And it was just him. Thereafter, the artist would work in two stages. In the summer, Monet would paint outdoors at the water garden, sketching directly onto small canvases. And in the winter, he would retreat to the studio to make paintings some 6.5 foot tall and up to 20 feet wide. The paintings were unlike anything that had come before in his work or any predecessors. The unique contribution of the water was the opportunity it provided for painting reflections, of course. of the clouds overhead, of the trees and flowers beside and above the pond, and the constantly changing light. Every morning, Monet would go to the pond and apparently do a bit of sketching, but especially just actually sit there and look. Stands of bamboo, which I mentioned, mingled with weeping willows, gorse, and other trees and shrubs. This is a really beautiful weeping willow painting, and I'm not sure how well you're able to see now, but this whole area here is just tree trunk. So these paintings in this last 10 years especially get very strange. And I was just reading an interview with Alex Katz this afternoon, and he said he loved all the, and this is by coincidence that he's talking about Monet, he loves all the water lily paintings except the ones with trees. So, sorry, Alex. Soft wisteria, white as well as purple, cover the Japanese footbridge that Monet had constructed, another nod to the Japanese influence. And he had a gardener from Japan actually come in the 1890s to help him figure out the design, including the footbridge. So here's the wisteria. So he's very interested in overhead effects. So there was the rose-covered trellis leading up to the house. Here's this wisteria that in this painting, as in many, you don't see coming from the support of the bridge, but instead just hovering above the water mysteriously. What you will know, if you look through Monet books regularly, there are a lot of upside-down reproductions, which is testimony to this. And this was a painting that I realized was reproduced upside down. These paintings, like this, he invented a new term for, because he felt they were something other than paintings. He called them grand decorations, which was a nod to his vision of them ultimately gracing a public space, much like would have been the case in earlier centuries in a palace or a cathedral. He did not exactly know for what space this would be the case, but he had a vision. He wanted to make paintings that convert the viewer's activity from observation to immersion. And he conceived the idea of making such a panoramic space and donating it to the French state, almost as if to transport his idyllic oasis in Giverny to the center of a rapidly modernizing and increasingly dismaying Paris. Monet made dozens of them. Today they're on view in museums all over the world, and principally in a space designed by Monet during his final years, on view at the museum house in the Orangerie in the Tuileries Garden in Paris. Here you see it in 1930, 3 years after Monet's death and its opening. The Musée Marmottan, which is an undervisited museum outside of Paris, has everything that Monet's son Michel donated, everything that he still owned, and donated it all to the Musée Marmottan. So you can see an incredible variety of water lily paintings there. MoMA, as I said, is lucky to own one triptych. Here it is in a different arrangement in a show we did 15 years ago. There are just a few triptychs outside the groups in Paris. And we also own one large single panel painting. And these were bought in the late 1950s. In all of these paintings, the composition zero right in on the water surface so that ordinary clues to the artist's and of course the viewer's vantage point are totally eliminated. The shimmer of light on the water and the intermingling of reflections of the clouds and the foliage further blur the distinctions between here and there. Monet worked on several panels at once, going back and forth between them. There he is with his cigarette, which was always in his mouth as he painted. This is another thing that's a parallel between gardening and painting. It's a ton of work. So even though Monet had his 6 gardeners to do the outdoors part, the indoors part was all on him. Not a crew of assistants starting them or even finishing them. And one thing you may not know about Monet, he was a very, very anxious painter, despite the calm appearance of those paintings. And with this, he has in common that quality with Matisse, who, like Monet, makes these paintings that look like they were easy to do, that they were a pleasure to make, and gave as much joy to the artist as they do to us. No, they didn't. Monet's letters and recorded conversations are just full of complaints about how he had to get up in the morning and go to the studio and suffer. But that there was nothing else for him to do. And he talked a lot about how many paintings he destroyed. Of the water lilies that survived, there are many more that didn't. He was very concerned about posterity, although nobody at that moment recognized that these were going to be his now considered greatest works. He did know it, and he said he didn't want any that would bring down the average of the quality. He worked and worked and didn't know when to stop as he's going from that one to that one. And so all of these late water lilies are dated simply 1914-1926, the time the studio was built to the time he died, because there was no saying as to when they were begun and ended, and none of them left. None of these were in a show. The paintings were sufficiently radical that Monet often doubted their worth, as I said, and went back at them talking about how he could save this painting. It was always a process of saving, of rescuing this disaster that had happened the day before. This process is at a far extreme from the painting by Monet that gave its name to the Impressionist movement, Impression Sunrise of 1872, which was shown at the first Impressionist exhibition in 1874. The term impression, even though this was not really Monet's doing, but it was seized upon by journalists, was standing for the idea that all these Impressionist paintings were just a spontaneous record of what the artist saw and quickly jotted down, because compared to academic French painting at that time, they seemed almost just like scribbles. In contrast, in these late paintings, the surfaces deliberately or just inevitably showed you the months and years of work. And I hope you can see in this one, this water lilies with the reflections of the weeping willows around it, it almost builds up kind of like a crust in many of these paintings. It was not only the pond surface that Monet painted during these last years. He would make large paintings that were close-ups of individual plants, irises, rhododendrons, peonies, and agapanthus. Here's a gorgeous painting in Monet's collection called Agapanthus. You see how the swirl of the paint conveys the breeze of the outdoor setting. So this does hark back to that early Impressionist ideal of plein air painting. This painting is 6.5 feet tall and 6 feet wide, and it is a pretty faithful evocation of the agapanthus I saw in May. Maybe many of you in this audience know the agapanthus are named for the Greek words for love, agap, and for flower, anthos. So he loved these flowers, as many people do. Another favorite subject was the Japanese bridge. that Monet built right after he started working on the pond. He often met with visitors there. He often stood there looking at his pond. The first paintings made after the water garden was built were of the Japanese bridge. And after seeing all the slides we've seen so far, you can tell that this 1899 painting does, in fact, look very legible compared to what would happen in the next 15 years. I will show you a painting. This is 1899. Here's a 1920-ish Japanese footbridge in MoMA's collection. Very unexpected sight of Monet in terms of the autumnal colors, but also you can see that this is as close as somebody in around 1920 is coming to pure abstraction. And yet this is a supposedly 19th century painter. You can see how very far Monet went in the span of time insofar as the bridge itself. Can you see where the bridge is? It basically went from being a subject to just a pretext for paint on a canvas. So these very late canvases, which are pretty modestly sized, this is probably 3 by 4 feet, together with the grand decorations, took the artist to pictorial territory he had not visited in more than 50 years of painting. The doubts that plagued him while he was making them were not unfounded. The water lilies were not popular at all for 25 years after his death. When the Orangerie opened in 27, we saw the early photo of it before, basically nobody went. To the degree that the French government began to hold exhibitions of other people's work in the space, just putting easels and panels in front of the water lilies, even though his agreement with the French government had specifically forbidden any other art being among them. During World War II, the glass roof, which he had stipulated, which obviously echoed that of the studio, was actually crashed in. And there are unbelievable photos, which I didn't want to bring to this talk, of the water lilies with all this crashed in glass on the floor. What's maybe a little less known is that the same fate came to Giverny itself. After his son's death, the place really became a wreck, and nobody tended to it, and it wasn't until 1966 that it was decided that they would establish a foundation, and then ultimately in 1980 open it and have the place transformed into this revered site that everyone visits today. It's absolutely appropriate to me that the paintings and the place that inspired them return to the public imagination hand in hand 3 or 4 decades after Monet had died, because they were inseparable one from the other, as we heard from Marcel Proust, no less than Marcel Proust, as many other later observers who had profoundly understood the unique symbiosis of Monet's work in the gardens and in the studio. It was a symbiosis so close that it would be impossible to say whether the plantings determined the paintings or the paintings determined the plantings. And I love this. Who has a question? Observation. Kirk.
Did his this shift toward abstraction was that, how much of that was in response to what was going on in art?
So the question is, how much did what else was going on in the art world have any impact on Monet? I can safely say none. So this is an interesting thing about art history. This is one of my favorite subjects. art history goes from movement to movement to movement, right? So post-impressionism goes to symbolism, goes to cubism, goes to Dada, goes to surrealism, goes to abstract expressionism. Artists don't do that, right? So here's this like highway of movements and progress. But for any great artist, they find themselves in impressionism or in cubism or whatever it may be, and then they branch off, they exit from that march of history, and they're on their own road. So he was taking impressionism to where it took him at the same time as he was ignoring totally cubism, Matisse. Matisse asked if he could come visit him in Giverny, and he said no. German expressionism, Russian suprematism. Malevich is the exact same years as his paintings, white on white, you know, no idea. Mondrian, couldn't care less.
But, if I can follow up, as figuration was ending, he didn't go in some conscious or half-conscious way like, hey, I can go this way and stop the children break.
I think the way I would put it is that the abstraction was kind of a seed in his non-abstract paintings that are more impressionist. So he was following that seed to abstraction. He wouldn't have even known the term abstraction. You know, that's a retrospective description after people like us know Pollock paintings. He would have seen these as pretty accurate descriptions of what those water lilies look like, I think. But it was his imagination taking him to this place that is far from realistic or naturalistic description. But no, I mean, he could have been reading theories by Kandinsky or Mondrian about, you know, what they didn't either call abstraction necessarily, but no, he didn't apparently. Yeah?
The painting impression made me think of Turner immediately.
Yes. Turner was a huge influence, and Monet and all the other impressionists often, not often, but did go to London and paint there partly as a result of that inspiration that Turner offered.
Yeah, it's quite amazing.
Yeah. Turner, I mean, another abstractionist avant-garde, right? Yeah.
Do you know anything about his development as a gardener? We know so much about his development as a painter. He seems to have really loved his subject.
Yes, he became really knowledgeable. Oh yeah, his development, his evolution as a gardener. I mean, like, what is amazing is that this place in the south of France, La Tour Marliac, actually has all the records of all his orders for like 3 decades. And so you could get a very precise answer to that question. But it just became more and more elaborate and more plentiful. So I'm not knowledgeable enough either about gardening or about Monet to give you a more specific answer about the change in tastes or development of expertise.
Was he from a family of gardeners?
No.
Obviously, he wasn't.
No. And he did love, however, the outdoors. Before he lived in Giverny, he worked in various places outside of Paris for different stretches of time that were, you know, this whole idea of painting outdoors that really began in the mid-19th century, even before the Impressionists. So making nature your direct subject as you're looking at it in your easels in the grass. There are these really great anecdotes about Monet painting trees as an Impressionist and getting mad that, say, there was a wind overnight and making his assistants tape the tree's leaves back on the tree so he could continue the painting that he had been working on. So yeah. Yeah.
A few years ago, there was an exhibition in Paris juxtaposing the abstract expressionist work of Joan Mitchell with Monet. And I'm wondering what you think, how much of this dramatic change in his palette and his abstracted style intentional in terms of him completely changing his palette to bright yellows and blood reds and, very, very abstract. Anyway, I'm curious your take on that.
So the comment is about the Joan Mitchell Monet show that was at the Fondation Louis Vuitton a couple years ago. And she was painting nearby Giverny in the 1970s and 80s, and very much inspired to go there because of him. And it made you think about the palette of his that seemed, in fact, so anticipatory of that of a 1950s generation American in herself, Canadian painter, who was often called an abstract impressionist. Joan Mitchell, not abstract expressionist. It's an unanswerable question to what degree his vision was dictating the palette, but there's no reason not to think that that was some component, right? I mean, our whole physiology is part of the equation, no matter what we're doing, but I think what's wrong is to cite that as the explanation, right? It's far larger than a symptom of a disease. But yeah, for sure, I can imagine. But also, what I think you could argue equally, he was in his 60s and 70s when he was doing this. He was the greatest living painter in France. Like, the freedom, even if you're tormented, that gives you is pretty good. Yeah.
Is there any record of the paintings that he destroyed? Do we know what they looked like?
No. He burned them. My guess is they were probably fine. With that, I will take this one last question, then we'll let everybody out into the cool, and thank you everyone for bearing with the temperatures and the light and so forth. Yeah.
Given what you were saying about his declining reputation in the 50s and 60s.
No, 50s and 60s it came back.
But it was coming back.
It came back.
The prices were like $16,000 for a large watercolor painting.
In the 50s.
Yeah.
So I have I'm too full of stories and it's 7 o'clock now, but here's what I can tell you to that point. So in the 30s and 40s, you could have bought these water lily paintings for, nothing. Then in the 50s, they began to become popular in large part because of the art that was being made by young artists that nodded to it, even, not on purpose. So MoMA bought our first water lily paintings in 1955 and 56. It was a triptych and a single panel. No, not a triptych, a long panel and a square panel. MoMA had a big fire in 1958. The only paintings that were totally lost in that fire were those water lily paintings, because they were hung in public space, not in galleries, because that was too large to fit in MoMA's galleries at that time, good old little MoMA. And so both of those paintings were completely burned, another instance of burning. Like 2 years after they were acquired, there was an enormous outpouring of grief and horror. So we went back to Paris, picked out the triptych and the single panel that we have today. They were 10 times the price of 3 years before. In part because we, and they went for it. They went for it nonetheless. Okay, that's it. Thank you.